So these two very complicated things, complicated supply chain, complicated consumers, make dealing with the fashion industry that much harder. And wherever we are today with its revenue, the fashion industry is growing, in part because our global economy, our global population is obviously growing, but in part obviously because of emerging markets and the way that fashion pricing is set. So we are certainly going to be buying more clothes. That is unfortunately not going out of fashion for now. So again, these are some headline nasty stats. I find them rather nasty, if I could say. You know, the one thing that really, really, really seriously irritates the hell out of me, if I may speak so plainly, is overconsumption and underutilization. The majority of the clothes that are produced every year will be landfilled or incinerated at the end of their life. It's generally thought that around 73% of the fibers that go into the fashion industry every year will be landfilled or incinerated within 1 year of their production. And we're looking at the moment of a global production of about 100 billion garments a year, or 150 billion garments. And that in itself is so ridiculous that we have two competing statistics of which no one really knows the truth. Do we produce 100 billion garments a year, or do we produce 150 billion garments a year? You can see the magnitude of those two numbers, and yet both of those data points are flying around. So consumers are chucking their clothes away like this. Ridiculous when you consider the impacts embedded in our clothing. Industry waste, 92 million tons a year. That's been flying around for years. I think it's probably worse. Every second, we have the equivalent of one dumper truck of textiles landfilled or incinerated. The fashion industry's carbon impact, everyone complains and moans and cannot agree on what the data is. So we say between 2 to 8%. It was flying around that it was 10% of global CO2 for a number of years. But again, you know, there's so much kind of conflicting reports on that. World Bank has it that the textile industry is polluting around 20% of the industrial water pollution. And don't worry, I'm not here to give you like a sort of boring list of statistics here, but the thing that I want to make it really clear is that it's getting worse. So despite all of this awareness and all of this kind of business, legislative awareness building, everything is actually really getting worse. So textile waste increasing. You can see it if you're reading that, 60% increase in textile waste from 2015 to 2030. And really the big ticket kind of slap you in the face statistic, if you want to choose one, and I have so many of them that are equally appalling, quite honestly, is, you know, reading again what I've put here is assuming business as usual growth in the fashion industry. The fashion industry is projected to use a quarter of the world's carbon budget by 2050. And if you really just think about whether that's going to happen, a quarter of the world's carbon budget, and you just think, you know, is our necessity to have so many clothes really worth that? And I'm sure everyone would agree that, you know, the answer to that would be no. And so the real topic of what I'd like to really try to speak about today is the circular fashion industry. So again, I've been at this for like nearly 20 years. And this sort of the bandwagon for circularity, you know, oh yeah, we're going to all start talking about circularity now. That kind of kicked off probably, I'd say, about 7 years ago. You started to hear about it at the conferences, and then it entered the jargon, circular fashion. And now if you go anywhere, circular fashion is spoken about all the time. It's like the new cool thing, new kid on the block. Circularity will get us out of jail. But the ridiculousness of this reality is that 0.3% of the global textile industry is circular. Now that is appalling. When the first kind of circular data came out, it was roughly 0.9%, so call it 1%. And since that, which is about it's about 8 years, that first report, we've come down to 0.3% circular. So we are doing an absolute abysmal, useless, pathetic, absolutely useless job at trying to make this fashion industry circular. And if you consider that 0.3% of the fashion industry is circular, meaning, you know, that these resources are going round and around as clothing, the majority, 99% of the fashion industry and all of our clothes, what you're wearing, I'm wearing. I mean, I don't know what everyone's wearing, but 99% of our clothes are being produced using virgin materials. So that is a real problem, because we are not achieving circularity, despite the fact that everyone wants to pat themselves on the back and say, you know, we're doing such a jolly good job. It's just not true. So in saying that, you know, we're banging on about this sort of circular economy jargon, and as I said, you know, it's everywhere when you look at sustainability conferences and stuff. I genuinely find circularity pretty difficult to conceptualize, and so this is our definition of it, and this is my very kind of basic baby sort of like secondary school or even elementary school definition of it and understanding. So to define it, I'm reading: the circular economy is a system where materials never become waste and nature is regenerated, and where responsibility is taken for the product's entire life cycle and its impact on the planet. So, if I could just explain, and you, I'm sure, are extremely intelligent, and I feel almost stupid bringing it back to nature, but nature has been working on a circular economy since the beginning of time, whenever that was. And, you know, what we should be doing for clothes is imagining that a jacket, a jumper, a pair of pants, whatever, is like a tree. So when they finish their life, that all the materials from the product are going back as nutrients and as materials for another life. And so really what we're looking for in a circular economy is materials never become waste, but critically also nature is regenerated in the process. Now, I don't know who works in fashion out there, but as well as, you know, circular economy becoming the next cool kid on the block, so too is regenerative agriculture also becoming, you know, the next, you know, like, oh, we've got to, you know, obviously source regenerative materials. And the concept of a regenerative material is that it sort of, in its agricultural process, it actually does more good for the planet than bad. So if the fashion industry were to become circular, we would not have any waste and we would regenerate nature. Now, let's just have a reality check. We're at 0.3%. So this circular economy, ultimately, a friend explained it to me, a bit like a holy grail. You know, you believe it and you think it might be there. And then another friend said it's a bit like a religion. You know, you just kind of got to believe that the circular economy might work. I described it to my kids as circular economy is a bit like a football match where you need the entire industry to be on the same team, whether you've got, you know, defenders, attackers, spinners or weavers or recyclers or sorters. But this circular economy is entirely a system of players. It is a team sport, if I could leave it at that. Now, central to trying to make clothes behave in a circular fashion and to behave like nature, very, very central to the circular economy. And this is as true for fashion as it is for cars, as for furniture or any other products that any of you might be involved in. Roughly, 80% of a product's environmental impact is locked in at the design stage. Now, this report's been flying around for years. So 80% of the environmental impact of a product is locked in at the design stage. And this, obviously, in this reference, I'm talking about fashion and apparel, but as I say, it's agnostic in a sense because you can relate this rough number to other products that are physical products. And it's quite obvious this, because on the one hand, you could think, okay, so 80% of the impact locked in at the design stage. Well, I mean, to me, I've read it so many times and thought about it. It is actually pretty obvious because at the design stage, you're creating the product. So everything, the choices, whether you're making a table, a pen, a pencil, or a pair of pants, you lock in that impact before it's even made, the decisions at the design stage. So what I'm seeing in the industry now is a broadening, an appreciation of what the design stage really, really is. Because if I say design stage, many of you might think, okay, that's a designer as shown, you know, sketching or someone on a 3D design software. But actually, when it relates to a complex product like fashion, the design stage is really considered to be the designer, creative director, the merchandiser, the pattern cutter, the garment manufacturer, the technicians at the garment manufacturer. It would be also the textile mill, the fabric dyeing, even the early fiber producer. So when we think about circular fashion, and then we think about 80% of a product's impact being laid down at the design stage, we're actually talking about the design stage really being the whole fashion supply chain. It is not just the designer, sketching a pretty skirt. So to try to put that sort of concept on a diagram, a circular fashion system on a diagram, this is like the go-to on circularity in the fashion and textile industry is the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And this is a very kind of famous, if such a thing can ever be famous, butterfly loop. And I'm not going to take you through it, really, but what it's showing is the systems within a circular fashion system that need to operate in order to make a fashion industry circular. This in itself is a PhD study just to understand this diagram. So of course it's extremely, extremely complicated. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. But what I'd rather do is share with you how in my brain I've simplified it. And this circular diagram is obviously very, very simple. And it's taken actually from Primark's circular design certification document that they recently did with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to really simplify the design stage. So you can see that you've got material consideration, durability considerations, and recyclability considerations. And I really like this because it's simple. It's made something horribly difficult really simple. So if I put innovators in the space within the circular fashion system, I've chosen a few businesses here in the material, durability, and recyclability buckets, if I could call them that. And like I said in my introduction, in my first question, really, the good news, let's just focus on some good news. And there are innovators out there. And, obviously innovation is the exciting part of our economy right now. And the innovators are absolutely, I've called them lining up, right? They are much more than lining up, actually. They are lining up and actually competing with one another. They are desperately raising funds. They are really trying to scale up. They are really trying to have, proof of concepts. Many of them are beyond proof of concepts, really. But if I could just first talk about materials, what we see on materials is like we have the main fiber basket, which is cotton, polyester, some man-made cellulose fibers, and then some animal, wools and silks. And that is basically the fashion industry. And then you have blends, of course, which are blended fibers. Now, I think I'm right in saying, please don't quote me on this, but roughly these alternative next gen weird and wacky fibers that are made out of spiders' webs, algae, coffee, all these really interesting innovations on new materials. They only make up, please don't quote me because I forgot to check this, but roughly 1% of the total fiber basket. So within material innovation, there are a lot of startups desperately working hard to raise the capital to create what are definitely more sustainable raw materials for fashion. And they're up against really, really, really big challenges because the entire fashion industry is not set up for, let's just say, yarn and fibers made from algae. The spinning factories, the mills, they're not set up for a lot of these new materials. So whilst, on the one hand, I really get excited about the innovation, the more kind of concerned part of me thinks that They need a lot more money. They need a lot more off-taker agreements. They need a lot more support from the fashion industry. And by the way, the obvious elephant in the room is that these materials cost much, 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 much more than virgin cotton, virgin polyester, for example. So it's extremely exciting at a molecular level. It's extremely exciting from a laboratory level. It's extremely creative. And my sort of concern is the time to scale up and adopt these materials. And that kind of always just leaves me with a slight kind of heavy heart with the new innovations. I mean, some of the ones that I've picked here, I'm not endorsing. And the reason I've picked them is that some of these, I've just been at a big conference last week, the Global Fashion Summit. And these were some of the companies being spoken about. And then next week, there's the Future Fabrics Expo in London. I just picked a few of the kind of the names that are popping up at the moment. So I'm definitely not endorsing or saying that any of these are better or not. So then if I look at durability, the big question is, what is it? I mean, do you know what durability is? You know what it means, but how do you know if your jacket, your trousers, and whatever are durable? I mean, even on a legislative perspective, it's not really known. How do you define durability? I mean, how do you define if you're happy? It's very difficult to define these things, and it's certainly very difficult to define durability. If you just think about those consumers, right? You've got people who are going out, let's just say they buy fast fashion, and somebody else buys ultra luxury. To be honest with you, both of those products could be durable, because durability is not just about the actual material, the way it was constructed. It's also about the person who's in charge of that product. So you could have somebody buying something super cheap and possibly not very well made, but actually keeping it very durable by taking care of it, washing it well, repairing it and stuff. And you could, on the other hand, have somebody who buys an amazingly expensive and well-made, durable product and treats it like trash, and then it's not durable. So durability is really, there's a lot of grayness in that. But as it relates to like innovations in the fashion industry, I've put tech innovations, and that's like the gold rush. The tech stuff is obviously very kind of, I'm going to use the word sexy because investors love it. Obviously there's a more definite return on investment with technology. I'm talking about soft technology technology of resale and rental. So the big kind of unicorn Vestiaire Collective, others like the Real Vintage, Depop, Authenticated. There's some B2B tech, and all of that is helping resale, which in itself supports durability. There's so many rental sites kicking off all over the place. There's well-funded repair centers. So there's a lot of new companies starting to help durability, to help longevity of the use phase of a garment. And then finally on recyclability, there's a hell of a lot going on there. And that's another area where we really, really work. And so recyclability is so interesting because you've got an industry that's churning out so many fantastic waste, I'm doing inverted commas, materials, highly valuable, fantastic fibers. And we are that stupid that we chuck them in landfill and incineration. I mean, it genuinely makes me extremely concerned, particularly if you put a value on that. So again, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation states that there's a 500 billion USD loss to the economy annually by clothing underutilization and the lack of recycling. 500 billion USD linked to clothing underutilization and lack of recycling. So the gold rush really is in recycling. You've got the next gen material startups trying to find, algae alternatives to polyester. Go for it. You've got a hard slog. And then you've got the recycling startups that are trying very hard to find chemical, microbial, enzymatic, whatever it ends up being, solutions that can recycle fashion's waste. And that, to me, is the biggest gold rush in history, other than the real gold rush and perhaps blockchain and Bitcoin and all that. But basically, recycling fashion's waste is the way out of this crisis. And yet we've been trying to do it for obviously 20 years. Probably investment and interest has been really, really increasing because we've started to see how much waste we're creating. And so even in recycling, even though, I'll often say to my kids, they can put a man or a woman on the moon, but we cannot even recycle clothing waste or unwanted clothing. I mean, so I'm excited about the recycling startups. Definitely there's some big investment coming into some of them, and definitely some of them are wanting to scale up. There's a lot of challenges about where their primary recycling sites are. There's oodles of challenges with regards to that, but I'm trying to be more positive. So that's a place where we absolutely have to sort out for recyclability. And then finally, the whole thing, I'm not going to go too much into traceability and transparency, but within the whole fashion industry, because of legislation and because of the increased requirements on reporting, so too are there just so many supply chain traceability and tracking, blockchain type startups that are servicing brands to prepare them for the upcoming broad range of legislative changes and policy changes. So I'm going to give you a few really basic examples with that kind of big intro and really having told you about the scale of the problems and the scale of how badly we're doing to address them. I'm just going to give you a few quick examples about what we have done at the Art Collective. This is definitely, I promise you, not a sales pitch at all, because I've really got nothing to sell. I'm truly just wanting to share with you a few of our on the ground insights. Okay, so I started a business. We work with luxury fashion brands on their waste materials. Now, fashion brands and luxury fashion brands in particular have a vast amount of waste. And the waste is in many different types of shapes and forms and countries. And where we have found a win-win-win solution, and it's horribly complicated, but we work specifically with luxury fashion brands that have IP sensitive waste, in inverted commas, materials. So by IP sensitive, I'm talking about fabrics that are prints, checks, logos, or very distinctive marks. And I'm also talking about unsold garment stock and or footwear and leather goods. So anything that has the brand's IP on it. Now, the obvious and very childish, I hope I haven't caused the wrong word to say childish, but I can only speak about my kids. I've got 4 kids. So obviously I hear the way they ask me questions. And, a lot of people would go, oh, well, why don't these luxury brands, just give away all their stuff to the poor? Forgive me, that came out really wrong. But you know the sentiment from a very young, naive perspective. And I'm sure you don't need to be really kind of told. But the obvious, enormous challenge for luxury fashion brands is that the brand value of the materials that they have that are unsold is immense. And if anyone can remember 2018, Burberry, I would say, unfortunately, a journalist went into their annual report and found I think it was listed as a destruction cost, but really it was a incineration fee. No, it was the write-off value on their stock, on their audited accounts, that basically linked the journalist back to 35 million pounds, must be, of value was written off through incineration. And that was really the first time that incineration was really widely discussed in the fashion industry. So I work with a lot of brands that have excess stock, and it's extremely difficult to recycle their excess stock and their materials, and it's extremely easy to incinerate. And it's also very cheap to incinerate. And many brands are saying, well, we do waste to energy, so therefore, it's not so bad. But many global groups, companies are really, except for French, many other companies are voluntarily agreeing not to incinerate anymore, which leaves them with a massive problem, which is that they've got a lot of stock. Now, no one knows how much stock is not sold out there in the world. But generally, it's thought that around 20% of products ever made will become waste. No one knows the truth. So with a bit of an introduction, in a nutshell, this is some of our little projects. Well, they're not little, they're quite big, actually. And I'm aware of time, so I'll probably wrap up in a couple of minutes. So Many of the brands who we work for are strictly confidential, but this one is not, and this is public information, so I'm able to share this. So what we did with Zimmermann is we took their IP sensitive fabric. This is a silk situation. And we basically took what was very valuable financially and also valuable from a brand protection perspective, because it was very obviously their material. We took their silk, and through a very, very collaborative, and actually, I think I'm safe in saying it's an industry first, we created with one of China's leading silk recyclers and spinners, a recycled product. So we went from a fabric that was IP sensitive, all of these steps, I won't take you through it, it's not necessary, back to a product. Now, the headline around this is that recycling IP materials in a controlled, brand secure and supply chain probably takes a year. It's very, very hard, and it's very, very takes a long time, and it also costs a lot of money. And that's why, coming back to incineration, why it is indeed so much easier for brands to incinerate. And let me tell you, they still, many of them are, obviously not the ones that we work for. And here's another example, again, pretty little pictures, but what they're not really telling you is the absolute grunt that goes in this. And this is, again, coming back to innovation, that word. It's tossed about all so easily. Innovation, circularity, sustainability, you know, this word, what is innovation? What does it even mean? And why I say that is because I can say that these recycling supply chains are very innovative, but they're also very archaic and very old fashioned, because, as I said, innovation in the fashion industry is quite lagging. So this is quite a breakthrough to really bring waste materials back into the fashion industry. Here's a couple of examples. This is an example of reusing waste. Pretty simple. The devil's always in the detail. So we work for a US luxury group, and leather is a tremendous financial and environmental cost. And wherever you live in the world, I can guarantee you, well, I don't know, you have to be near production, but there is a tremendous amount of leather offcut waste all over the place. And the recycling solutions are pretty slow to solve these. So essentially, other luxury fashion brands that we work with, we take their offcuts and we design into offcuts, and we make small leather goods. This is another really complicated IP sensitive example. So again, we take finished garment, I'll use the word waste, inventory. You know, many luxury brands are sitting on a huge financial value of stock on their balance sheet. And then over time, when they really kind of realize that they can't sell it, they've tried friends and family, they've tried discounts, they probably wouldn't do a white label. They would have to basically get rid of unsold stock. And that's where we support a number of brands. So these are generic and private photos. There's nothing confidential here. So essentially, the process is to manually disassemble this unsold stock. So if you even look at whatever you're wearing, you will probably see that you've got buttons, zippers, trims. You might have lining materials. And so what we have to do is manually, like carving up a chicken, we have to cut this garment back down to its component parts. It's all done under CCTV. It's all very, very, very confidentially managed because of the value of these products. And then ultimately, we will recycle all of the materials that we can retrieve from these garments. And so to date, you know, we've worked like crazy for 7 years, honestly. We've rescued 550,000 yards of textile and clothing waste, 21,000 feet of leather waste. And it's really through proper collaboration, actually, because it's complicated work. So to start to wrap up, really, why is circularity so complex? Because, and I hate to say it, but the whole system needs to change. And the reason why I hate to say it is because systems change sounds like it's never going to happen, right? How do you change a system when the system is so entrenched? You know, the system is definitely making money for a lot of stakeholders. And so how do you change that system? You know, like it's possible, but it's not really happening. So if you think about this sort of diagram of what a circular fashion system would look like, what you have to imagine is that each loop, each dot, which represents a process within the fashion supply chain, is an industry of its own. So the fashion industry is a collection of thousands and thousands and thousands of industries. It's not one industry. And that might be the same for other sectors that you're working in. And so if we want to make fashion circular, we have to understand every kind of stakeholder's pain points and opportunities. And the whole system actually needs to work together to get the job done. And therein lies the problem, because the fashion industry is not very good at doing that. So it's, you know, what the industry is really calling out in order to get it done is for legislation. And it's been really interesting. If I go back to like, why is it so complex? Like 10 years ago, people were saying, oh yeah, consumers have to do it. Vote with your dollar. Come on, you consumers, you can do it. You can lobby your brand to do the right thing, blah, blah, blah. That never happened. How on earth do we expect consumers who don't understand really honestly whether it's cotton or polyester, how do we expect consumers to drive the change? I mean, I just don't believe in that. So that was 10 years ago. Everyone thought that would happen. And then everyone thought, oh, you know, purpose-led business, strong, courageous leadership. Yeah, it's the private sector that will be, you know, innovating, purpose-driven. You know, during COVID, everyone thought, you know, businesses obviously had a massive role to play in being ethical and responsible. And, you know, the C-suite could do it, you know, and the C-suite is having a lot of challenges. They're not really, really doing it. And so now it's all about legislation. And now the fashion industry is really saying, okay, even the fashion industry itself is saying, please, could you legislate? And again, this is how I explain it to my kids. I say, imagine there's a football match going on and there's no referee. And, you know, it's a bloodbath on that football pitch because there's no referee. Well, that's where we're at in the fashion industry. And so now we're calling for legislation. And absolutely, there is supposedly 35 pieces of sustainability linked legislation that's due to come in effect roughly in the next 2 years. So we hear about it. We know it's supposedly coming. It's sort of, the timeline is rocky. And really, I think legislation is the one thing that's going to make this industry of industries, the thousands and thousands of industries that are all connected to make this fashion industry, actually behave in a much more responsible manner, where unfortunately without a referee, without legislation, it can't seem to really do it for itself. And so that was really, I hope that I've been able to provide some sort of insight into what I do and to perhaps what I think and what I've learned. And yeah, I'm now back in the room, and I think you might have been looking at my chin the whole presentation, so I do apologize.
No, yeah. We see you and we don't see the presentation. First of all, great insights. Thank you for reminding us that it's so important what we wear as well, and the impact that we have into basically the climate change and everything. I have lots of questions, and I see lots of questions also in the chat, and I believe Andres here also has questions. But let me start first with one, because I see also among the people in the chat, I was having the same one, right? You said around 80% of products' environmental impact is locked in design stage. On one side, when I hear this is a good news, right? Because it means that probably it's not too much to coordinate it, so in one stage. But then, what are the biggest barriers really preventing them from adopting these more sustainable practices or innovations in this stage?
Well, I think it's probably price point, really. Well, it's probably two things. There's one is that the fashion industry and its supply chain, they're not in silo, but there needs to be much more collaboration at the design stage, right? So the designers and the brands need to listen to their supply chain. So the kind of power hierarchy needs to change, and we're definitely seeing that. So for me, that's about, you know, a collaborative process, but where that process likely will fall down is going to be on price. Because essentially, for products to be more durable, made of safe materials, made of recyclable materials, made with disassembly in mind, made with, you know, repairability, easy care, all of these things that need to happen at the design stage to happen, you basically need to pay more for the materials, safer chemistry, better fabrics, better trims, better production. And when I say better, I mean higher value. And so really, if you look at the barriers to circular design, one of the barriers in my view, and Redress has done some research on that, is that the CFOs are so distant to the design stage. At the product planning stage, where you're doing all the costing for a product, the sustainability bit is not really being factored in at that stage. And last week at this conference, the Global Fashion Summit, it was quite interesting. A very prominent fiber company was really saying, you know, we can make better fibers, we can bring in better chemistry, we can make better textiles, but the price point needs to go up. Full stop, brands. And really that price point is looking at like a 3% increase. And I'm saying on the cost of a good, if the brand could increase, and I'm talking about a mass market brand here. And so I think one of the challenges is really that the brand's not willing to spend more for the product. And therefore, to answer your question, more circular, sustainable design is falling over because of money.
I get it. Christina, one thing is that this kind of demand for circularity comes from inside the industry. But I do believe there is also the demand from the consumers, right? Like, when do you think will be the tipping point that the consumers will demand circularity as a default? Right now,
No, well,
yeah.
dream. Okay, listen, dream on. Okay, because let me tell you, I have read more research and papers and surveys that, you know, consumers from India, from the US, from here, from there, from China, well, I don't care. I'm bored of it because they all say and they don't do. Okay, we know that for sure. All right. Mm-hmm. And so even what I found really, really interesting was that if you look at, if you recall the Rana Plaza industrial catastrophe in which a factory collapsed, killing 1,320, I believe, or 27. Forgive me if I don't get that exact number correct, because it was the most horrific industrial disaster that happened in Bangladesh in 2013. And if you remember that, we had the most outrageously sad, depressing vision of these workers being crushed to death. And post that, there was a big movement by consumers, because that was like, you could see it. It was appalling. And many, many consumers supposedly woke up, all right, to the Rana Plaza. It took something that bad. But why I'm telling you this is because research from UBS has found that there was no ESG kind of downturn in terms of, there was no negative ESG outcome to the multiple fashion brands who were actually working within those factories as it relates to consumers' attitudes towards them, and specifically how many clothes consumers bought from those brands. So why am I saying that? Because I've given up on consumers. Sorry. There you go. That's the answer, because they didn't even do a dent in the kind of post Rana Plaza. And so how on earth do you expect a consumer to understand circularity, understand pesticide pollution, understand carbon when it's so far away? So that's why I just don't think we have time for consumers. Unfortunately, we just don't have time.
Christina, first, great presentation. But we have analogies of different industries which have transitioned to circular, and we can learn from them. So, for example, architecture and the buildings went lead, and they were all about circular. It took a certain amount of time, and a community came together to make that happen. But on the other side, I understand the consumer is a narcissist. The consumer is all about, do I look good? Do I look attractive? Do I look whatever? And the choices are reasons are very different versus saving the planet. right? So at that moment, do I look the most different, most unique, most attractive, whatever it is. But in food, we saw it also happen. And I'll just give an example. I took my daughter and her friends out for dinner once, and they were ordering from a menu for fish. It was a fish restaurant. And they immediately open up an app and says, we can't eat that fish or that fish or that fish because how they were actually hunted or killed, or were they in that situation that they might become a species that's disappearing. So my question to you is a combination of things. I agree with you that this is a systems problem. I agree with you that the science and technology is not there yet. I also agree with you that whatever we produce must provide all the utilities of fashion and comfort, and yet be at the same price or low. Right? I totally agree with all the statements you make. But do you believe that there might be a stamp that you can put on a tag of clothes that kids and younger people will scan and say, what's the traceability of this product in terms of its material usage and everything else? And maybe that's where you can start with to get the young consumers to start making choices and then put pressure on the fashion designers.
Yeah. I think, if we met in, I don't know how many years, if we met in 50 years, it would be wider spread. And if we met in, I don't know the current French policy, but absolutely that is being led by the French government in terms of, product transparency. And that is only for larger scale businesses. So in the short term, it will start to happen, and that will become in legislation for larger revenue businesses. Adoption by more of the fashion industry, I do really genuinely believe it will happen. And because we will not go back in our desire and need for transparency. That's not going to change. So really, we're looking at so blockchain I'm not a blockchain expert. We are going to start working with it. So I know it superficially. So blockchain, obviously critical to be able to trace materials. And even DNA transparency and testing. So yes, it will be there. I think one of the major challenges is, of course, verifying. So there's tracing the supply chain, which will happen, right? The but is that if you know much about sort of life cycle analyses, it's incredibly difficult to compare and believe in the savings. So again, much like consumer surveys, you see this product used 38% less carbon. And I'm always like, we do it as well. But, how good's your data? What are you really comparing it? Is your data any good? Do you really believe what you read in terms of carbon savings? So what I'm saying to your daughter and our future grandchildren is that they may well be able to scan a QR code and find out that it was X and Y and Z materials made in A and B and C countries, and it has a lower impact of X, Y, and Z. That should happen in the future, and it's all going to be dependent on the accuracy of the data and then the adoption of transparency tools along the supply chain. I really do think it will happen. But that said, if you go back to your question about the LEED certified architecture, if I were to come to a building, it would be the building supply chain would be a lot more complicated than your jacket. The other way around, your jacket's supply chain is much more complicated than the building in terms of provenance of materials. But I'm not an expert on building, so I do not want to go above my paycheck and say the wrong thing. But that's truly the problem with the fashion industry, is it's fragmented. I'm no good at social, but I know for sure, of course, that there's double booking, double audits, all sorts of things going on the social side, outsourcing of production. And so even if you were a buyer of shirts, pants, fabric, buttons, trims, whatever you're buying, you don't actually really know if that product was truly made by the company that you're actually buying it from. Yeah.
And then going back to the thing with, let's say, bottles and beverages, where you had a deposit on your can, and there will be a nickel deposit. If there were government taxes or government penalties saying there's a potential to make 5 cents on any clothes, are those things happening? Recycling,
yeah,
where people are making money. They need to make money though from the recycling. Is that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So the EU is absolutely leading in terms of legislation. What I understand is California very much leads in chemicals, and this is how my friends who are sort of deep in the industry would describe it. And the EU is definitely the leader in terms of circular design. So there's a whole raft of eco design strategies and principles that will be put in place, including recycled content and recyclability, and getting to your exact point, extended producer responsibility, EPR. And so the fashion industry is probably like waiting with bated breath for this legislation to be enacted. We don't know when it's going to come, but to put in a levy on imports to raise funds to deal with the recycling. So it's not an incentive for the consumer, but it's actually a levy for the brand to raise funds to cover improved recycling.
Christina, I was really intrigued by all the material science research going on new types of materials, new types of technology in the clothes itself, or of what's going on. And in the future, I can imagine wearing a pair of clothes that actually cools you when you're hot, warms you up when you're hot, when you're cold, dries you, and all that other stuff, including giving you comfort, a squeeze, or whatever else is needed in the future as science and technology moves forward. Do you see that as a big driver of innovation and fashion? Because the purpose of this audience over here is looking for places across the value chain where you can innovate, that can create step change, value creation in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would perhaps call your description of this wonderful fabric, I want some, as a sort of wearable technology, perhaps. And I think that where the beauty of innovation comes into fashion is in wearable technology. And particularly, I'll give you an example and maybe you've got innovators out there, but any sort of tracking, and it sounds like you want to track your teenagers. No, but for dementia, for elderly, for, there are, I've seen innovations in basically wearable technology for a tracking textile for, elderly people or not who have dementia. So that's like, these are beautiful integrations to help the safety and well-being of people. I really, really feel really passionately about that one in particular. It's a very, very small example, but I think wearable technology, functional fabrics, performance-related fabrics are obviously very important. And I'll give you, obviously, I want to give you an example. I'm sorry, it kind of deviates a little bit, but it's important. Like if you just think about athleisure, or you think about outerwear, kind of high-tech functional materials. We recently had a banning of PFAS. If you've ever heard of PFAS, it's a forever chemical. It's kind of the same thing that's on your frying pan if you have a Teflon frying pan, right? And it stops your eggs frying, but it also stops the water from going into your clothes. And just heads up, I think France banned it 6 months ago. Don't quote me on that, something like that. And just as an example, PFAS does a great job to keep the water off your skin, right? But it's a really bad chemical. And in the banning of that in France, one company had 200,000 yards of it. And I'm allowed to say this. I've said it in a media interview, and I'll obviously not say who that company was. But those 200,000 yards went to landfill. Forever chemicals.
No savings, no benefits. Crazy.
Yeah. So I just wanted to share, innovation sometimes, and then they get outdone with new innovations. But I realize,
Christina, we are at the time where we wrap this webinar up. And so people who have signed up for that 1 hour slot can escape. So let me just basically wrap this thing up with them. Stay online though. For everybody who's been participating, thank you very much for being here on the GIMI webinar. This is a think tank where we bring great speakers who provoke your thinking about what's coming next, what's next. And in here, techniques and opportunities for innovation. Today we had Christina Dean, Dr. Christina Dean, who's an expert in circular economy, in fashion. She herself is an entrepreneur and has done really well in building a business around that space. And she's an expert and speaks on this topic multiple times. Christina, let me give you the last minute to give any advice, any coaching, or for people to reach out to you.
Oh, well, thank you. Last minute, I suppose it's a sense of encouragement, because one can oscillate with the sheer complexity of both being an innovator and then a startup, or maybe you're raising capital, facing enormous challenges. And I suppose the calling that I give even myself is to persevere with optimism in mind and a big collaborative kind of spirit and a sense of determination, despite the ever-changing kind of global landscape that we're kind of suffocating in, is to do our best as human beings to do what we're called to be experts in and to contribute positively.
Beautiful. Christina, let me just make sure I wrap this up with one statement. I thought I heard you say that we are not just looking for circularity. We're actually looking for not net zero. We want to actually, the more we consume, the better the planet gets. The more we consume, the better our society becomes. So the very consumption itself, which we can't stop, actually benefits our planets, benefits our environment, benefits our society and our communities. And think about not net zero, but think about net negative. And with that, thank you very much for all of you participating. Join us next week. Thank you very much. Christina, Steve, stick around for a few more seconds.
Oh, sure.
I thought it was a good conversation. We can break it up in terms of saying, can we, and you seem kind of fatalistic with